Hello, everyone, and welcome to Morals and Markets, the podcast, now on YouTube. Morals and Markets is a 90-minute webinar hosted for students on the fourth Thursday of every month by Atlas Society senior scholar and professor of political economy at Duke University, Dr. Richard Salsman. After the live webinar is finished, we upload his content to all of your favorite podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, Google, and of course, the Atlas Society's website at atlassociety.org/podcasts. If you enjoyed this content, I hope you'll consider checking out other episodes, liking, sharing, and subscribing to the podcast so that we can reach more people. With that being said, this week's episode is the economics and politics of cryptocurrencies. It's an episode that Dr. Salzman hosted back in January with a former Duke student, Jack Kriesel, who currently writes for Bitcoin magazine and is very positive about the future of Bitcoin. We hope that you enjoy the content, and if you'd like to see more content like this, we hope you'll consider making a tax-deductible donation at atlassociety.org/donate. Thank you.
Abby, thank you again. You're a great host. Or is it hostess? You're great. Thank you, Abby. I know a lot of work goes into this. Let me just read from the descriptor we gave for this session. In this session, we're going to examine whether cryptocurrencies are genuine or instead fraudulent as monies. Okay, there's Salzman doing his either or binary thing, but okay, there it is. What role have they played in the economy so far? How might they influence the future? What explains their attraction? What are their main risks, and might they spread as a contagion globally? Do cryptos differ materially? And if so, in other words, among different cryptos? And if so, why might that matter? El Salvador has recently designated Bitcoin as legal tender, which really goes together with its fiat money. Is that a bad thing? China, I think 3 times now, has tried to ban it. Why? What lesson is there? What are they really banning too? Is it the use of it, the mining of it? We'll talk about that. Are cryptos, and we'll focus mostly on Bitcoin tonight because of our special guest, but are they an alternative, a competitor to government fiat money, or instead a possible model for well-run public digital currencies? Public digital currencies, meaning are central banks likely to just take over, co-opt, not kill, but co-opt cryptos and use them themselves. Now, I just want to give you a little background because I'm going to introduce a special guest very soon, who's going to basically, I hope he knows that talk most of the time because he knows more than I do about this. But I'll tell you why this interests me and why I talked to our special guest so much recently. It was almost more than 3 decades ago that my first work in economics and politics was on money and banking, and my first book was called Breaking the Banks: Central Banking Problems and Free Banking Solutions, 1990. I'm dating myself. There was a financial crisis going at the time. My general theme was central banking was awful. Central banking meaning a government monopoly on money. And my conclusion from a lot of empirical work was that central banking was in place not to replace a market failure banking system, but to help the government finance itself cheaply. And in the process of doing that, it eroded the financial prudence in the private banking sector and undermined the financial integrity of banks to the point where they would be precarious and prone to being bailed out. In 1995, I focused more on the issue of the gold standard, not so much the banking system, but what monetary standard historically had seemed to hold up as efficient, practical, moral, and the gold standard really shone in that regard. Now, if you know the history, we have not been on any form of gold-based money for now 50 years. And if you go back 300 years, there isn't a 50-year period where that's been true. So we're truly in uncharted waters, to the extent that the governments of the world can issue money almost without limit, not restricted to any tangible thing. A couple of other things. To this day, I think the last thing I wrote for the Cato Journal was an appeal for the Federal Reserve to at least adopt a gold price rule. But my cynicism about central banking over the years really undermines my own argument when you think about it, because why would central banks behave? If I'm right, they're not going to want to have their hands tied by anything. But just so you know, so I'm on the record for still being a holdout, a gold standard guy. But I really love the whole crypto phenomenon and the debate it brings up. And actually, it does bring up a debate between three main systems: fiat money, gold standard, which has a much longer history, and this new thing called crypto, this new, very technologically advanced, very cleverly organized and coordinated system. So anyway, that's as context. And now I have to introduce someone I just adore. He's a Duke student of mine. I've known him for a couple of years. His name is Jack Kriesel. Jack is on the call here. So Jack, wave your hand and say hello and unmute yourself and anything else you have to do. A couple of things about Jack. He's been in some of my courses, but we also have these kind of coffees on the weekends where we gather together, what I call Friends of Liberty. And he's just schooled me on Bitcoin. I mean, I was semi-skeptical about it, but he's really, really learned about it. He writes for Bitcoin Magazine. So make sure you look up his stuff. The one I'm looking at right now, Bitcoin, Our Only Hope to Separate Money from the State. A fabulous essay, but he's got 4 or 5 of them already. He's been writing, I think, since, was it spring of 2021, Jack? They're just great essays. And here's the thing about Jack. He is not just knowledgeable about the technical aspects of Bitcoin, and we'll get into that a little bit, but I think what's maybe more interesting is he is knowledgeable about these other things I've been talking about, namely the long history of money, the use and abuse of money and the banking system by the state, by an overarching state. He's worried about those kind of things. And so he's an interesting guest, I think, for the Atlas Society, because the Atlas Society, cares about objective money, objective reasoning, limited government, a love of America in its traditions. And I can attest that Jack's that way too. So I think I'd like to start with, and Jack, what we normally do, can you hear me? I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you. Happy to be here.
Great to see you again. By the way, the other thing Jack's doing right now, I hope you don't mind all this praise, Jack. I just have to. The other thing, Jack is teaching a Bitcoin course at Duke. I mean, it's just incredible. They call them house courses. He can talk about it more if he wants. And students it's standing room only. Students are just dying to get in, and he's teaching them, once a week, 2 hours, 2.5 hours, mostly about Bitcoin, but crypto, starting with the techniques, but also going into this history and stuff. It's just fabulous. He's an expert at Duke. I'm sure he's an expert actually nationally. So he asked me, I'm very humbly said, yes, I'd be glad to co-host this, but he's teaching it. He's teaching all of it. I'm just coming in with this fuddy-duddy perspective on the gold standard. I kid a little bit here, but so that's the expertise is such that he put together a syllabus, he put together readings, and these students are just loving it. So I don't know what Jack's future is. He could be an entrepreneur in crypto, or he could be a teacher, or he could be anything in between. And Jack, welcome. And I thought I would just start with a couple of questions to you. But my hope really, and this is a 90-minute thing, Jack, so I hope it's not too burdensome for you. I thought I would just introductory questions, get it going, get it moving, but then gradually cede the floor to you and let you elaborate on any aspect that interests you. And then there's going to be a bunch of questions. There's going to be a bunch of feedback questions, maybe pushback. And if you're comfortable fielding them, I'm sure you are, because you've heard them from me, Jack. You've heard every objection from me, right? So anyway, welcome to the Atlas Society.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
What is cryptocurrency? Just what is it?
Well, like kind of the simplest base explanation for cryptocurrency. Well, the crypto in currency comes from the fact that cryptocurrency is basically a digital currency that is cryptographically secure. So basically the computer network that operates the cryptocurrency, I mean, you've probably heard of this thing, it's called a blockchain. Most cryptocurrencies, they run on what's called a blockchain. And the security that then goes into your kind of account within this cryptocurrency, or you're making transactions, that's all done using cryptography. So now actually a lot of cryptographers in the field, they hate the term cryptocurrency and they hate the term crypto since it's kind of been co-opted by them. Yeah. And cryptography is actually a fairly small part of cryptocurrency, but that's kind of the just basic. That cryptocurrency is pretty much just a digital currency that is cryptographically secure,
Yeah.
and has no central authority. And that's
Now,
where a lot of debate comes in.
Yeah.
Since
You mean the
cryptocurrencies
decentralized
actually
versus
do have that central authority.
So the first time I heard crypto, Jack, I thought, well, that's like code breakers or so. Secrecy, right? And that's a big part of it, right? But not in a nefarious way. The crypto part of it, in this sense, is you might put it as no, it's security. Just like you wouldn't want people breaking into your house or your safe deposit box. The crypto part of cryptocurrency, good thing. Good thing you're saying. Maybe not
Exactly.
the right word. Yeah.
The cryptocurrency part in crypto is pretty much just with its security. And now from there on, there are obviously tons of different kinds of cryptocurrencies, and we'll get into that. But there are cryptocurrencies that are aimed at being private, obviously. And one main misconception with Bitcoin actually is that Bitcoin is anonymous. Bitcoin is in no ways anonymous. I've shown Professor Salsman how I can kind of look through transactions, and pretty much it's linked to a pseudonym. So there are a lot of these misconceptions around it, but yes, within cryptocurrencies, that huge big umbrella term, there are obviously a bunch of different kinds, and some of them are private, and they kind of all serve a different purpose, or at least say that they do.
Now, the other thing that interests me, Jack, I've told you this before, cryptocurrency. So now everyone knows what a currency is. They have them in their wallets, or they used to. Those little paper things, with George Washington and Alexander Hamilton on them. But this is such a high-tech thing. Currency is kind of like old-fashioned, like why is that even part of the definition? But I think it's for maybe epistemological reasons, unless people think of it in terms of, well, crypto, what is that? It's mysterious. But currency, they know what currency means. And if they're thinking, this is a different kind of currency. Both of those words are crypto is like modern and mysterious. Currency is like pedestrian, old, we've had it forever. So the term, I'll come back to this later when we talk about Bitcoin and mining and things like that, and wallets. It's interesting to me, Jack, I think I've told you that the terminology is interesting because it still uses old terms almost to make it more real to people what the heck we're talking about. And I think we have some philosophers in the room who are interested in the use of concepts and whether concepts are tied to reality or not. And when it comes to money, money can be pretty abstract. But if you can concretize it down to barter and gold and representations of gold and then plasma and credit cards and then all the way up to crypto, we're talking about more and more abstract forms. And I think the question from some of the philosophers will be, is this thing tied to reality in the way that people thought the gold standard was? All right, let's go to Bitcoin, where you're really a specialist. So fair to say, Jack, is Bitcoin Bitcoin particularly, a type of cryptocurrency, or is it something else?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is the first ever cryptocurrency. It's kind of what started this whole thing off. And kind of just to touch on a bit of what Professor Salsman just said about whether cryptocurrencies can kind of be called currencies. I'm sure we're going to talk about that more later on. But I personally believe that the term cryptocurrency is a misnomer.
Wow. I don't think I've heard you say that. I don't think I've heard you say about that before. That's cool.
Yeah, most people. Well, the reason is that most people in cryptocurrency would completely agree, since I'd say 99.9% of cryptocurrencies are not actually trying to be money of any kind. They're just simply these tokens that are, and this, so we'll go more in depth on this once we kind of move off of Bitcoin, but most cryptocurrencies aren't actually trying to be money. Now, Bitcoin is trying to be money. And that's where people disagree on it. I personally don't know if it can be called money yet. And obviously, with all the philosophers here, that can be an interesting discussion. But yeah, so Bitcoin was the very first cryptocurrency. It was pretty much, now it was founded in 2008. It was finally launched in 2009. The founder, some of you probably heard, Satoshi Nakamoto. That's the pseudonym. And no one knows who it is. No one knows who founded Bitcoin. I think that's personally one of the greatest parts of Bitcoin, the fact that there's no founder, there's no target associated. Since imagine you just created this currency that, if successful, threatens the strength of every government in the world, you would probably have quite the target on your back. So whoever Satoshi Nakamoto is, they stayed pretty smart by being silent. And without that leader, Bitcoin has been able to thrive. But yeah, Bitcoin is the first ever cryptocurrency. But what it really is the culmination of about 30 years of work in the fields of cryptography, even economics, and it really ties together these different fields. And then in 2009, once the kind of technology enabled it, Bitcoin came into existence.
It's interesting, Jack, that the founder is himself, herself, crypto, secretive.
Exactly. Now, I've obviously got my theories about who
Yeah.
it is. Kind of everyone in Bitcoin
Yeah.
has their theories. And it's fun since when Bitcoin was founded,
Yeah.
it was founded on the internet. And Satoshi Nakamoto, this creator, whoever they are, you can track their progress with Bitcoin since they constantly were uploading their thoughts
Yeah.
to this forum
Right.
and interacting with the very first users. So
Right.
you can look through the history of it and you can see kind of piece together details about Satoshi, and you learn that Satoshi had very political motivations for creating Bitcoin. In the very first block of Bitcoin that was mined, a technical term that we'll get into, there was a newspaper clipping from I believe it was a newspaper in England, and it was a headline of banks on the brink of second bailout. So this was obviously following the 2008 crisis, and just that alone in there, as well as Satoshi's other kind of writings that we can see, you can tell that there's a political motivation for creating Bitcoin. And as such, many supporters of Bitcoin come from that political or philosophical bent.
Yeah, we'll talk about that more. By the way, the listeners, they're not all philosophers, so you need not be intimidated by. There are some economists here, political scientists, business people, commercial people, artistic people. Why 2008? I mean, you mentioned the bank bailouts. And by the way, one of the things Jack provides in this house course at Duke, that initial paper really fascinated me, Jack. There's a paper by this pseudonym or this person laying out what she is doing, right? Was that a collective effort? It's not very long either. It's less than 20 pages, right? But they're writing out what they're doing. And there's this document, right? It was one of the readings.
Yeah, the white paper that was released.
The white paper, okay.
Yeah, it's called the Bitcoin White Paper, and it was released in 2008. And then Bitcoin, the very first transaction or the network itself, was then launched in 2009. But the white paper was what got it all started. And when Satoshi wrote this white paper, he sent it out to this mailing list. It was called the Cypherpunk mailing list. And now this was a collection of people.
Not cyber, but cipher.
No, Cypher.
Cypherpunk, yeah.
It's a group of individuals who their motto was Cypherpunks write code. Basically, what that means is that they were people mainly, again, cryptographers, programmers, who were focused on ways to use technology to increase privacy, protect individual rights, things like that. So Satoshi must have been a member of this mailing list, and this mailing list had individuals who had been working towards a Bitcoin. One person who could be Satoshi who was on this mailing list, he invented this thing called BitGold. There was another one called B-Money. Now, these were things that came around in the early 2000s, but they didn't solve this thing called the double spend problem, which Bitcoin was the first ever to do, and is why it is now the largest cryptocurrency and what really started cryptocurrencies. But Satoshi sent this white paper then to this mailing list, and very few people responded back. I mean, I'm sure if you saw this paper explaining this brand new global currency, you would think it would be a scam too. And so did everyone on that mailing list, except for a small few who then working with him or her is taken off since then.
Jack told me once, I hope this is not telling tales out of school. Jack told me once, maybe 3-4 years ago, first time he heard about it, he said something like, "That's the dumbest thing I ever heard." Am I quoting you correctly?
Correctly.
And it must be a scam. Okay, but now you can tell he thinks it's one of the most amazing things ever invented. So that journey alone, Jack, from an intellectually curious and smart guy like yourself, is a lesson to all of us. any idea that initially strikes us as that's just crazy, then you think about it more and you research it more, and I know you have. It's kind of interesting just as it's not just intellectual curiosity, Jack. I think one of the things I admire in you is the open-mindedness of thinking, well, let me look at the evidence, but not so open-minded that your brains fall out. So that's a hard thing to balance. Now, did you get any impression of Bitcoin? By the way, the language Bitcoin, coin is more concrete than currency, even, because currencies were created as convertible into coin, into actual weights of precious metals. Bit, I assume, comes from bits and bytes. Is that why they chose bit?
Yeah, and I had a great little
Okay.
etymology behind Bitcoin, but I'm forgetting the
Good.
exact
I love
story
etymology.
now. But pretty much, bit is just a computer term, and and then pair it with coin.
That's kind of clever. It's like two worlds that, I don't know, it's like Reese's peanut butter. It's like chocolate and peanut butter. It's a wonderful comment. All right, so say a little more why you write for Bitcoin Magazine. I've read all your essays twice. They're just brilliant. So I highly recommend anyone on this call go to Bitcoin Magazine and just search for Jack Kriesel, K-R-I-I-E, right? S-E-L. They're just brilliant. Why are you particularly enamored of, in a rational way, Bitcoin? Because there's many others, right? Ethereum, and so make the case why. What is unique about Bitcoin versus these others?
So this is a question that I'm often asked, and a lot of people within the cryptocurrency space are asked this, and my beliefs about this stuff would differ greatly from any other people involved with this, and I just certainly have a lot of different opinions than people in this space, but I strongly support Bitcoin, and it's the only one that I hold. And there's a reason why it's the only one that I hold when it comes to all these other cryptocurrencies. Because what I'm focused on mainly, and why Bitcoin interests me, or cryptocurrencies in general, is because I think our money is broken. I think the current fiat standard, from talking with Professor Salsman and then some of my own research, I think that system is broken. And out of all these cryptocurrencies, Bitcoin is the only one that even has a shot at having any impact on that, changing the current system, or being money. The reason I say that Bitcoin is the only one with that was the circumstances that came together for Bitcoin's creation can't be replicated by any other cryptocurrency. It's either going to be, when it comes to a cryptocurrency threatening any current paradigm, it's either Bitcoin or bust. Bitcoin is the first ever example of kind of absolute scarcity in history. Bitcoin is, when Bitcoin was created, since I see this question in the chat, when Bitcoin was created, there are only ever going to be 21 million Bitcoin. Currently, about 19 million Bitcoin have been mined. Every 10 minutes, new Bitcoin is released into circulation. And every 10 minutes, that number is about 6.25 Bitcoin. Now, that number progressively gets slower, gets cut in half every 4 years, the closer we get to that 21 million. Now, these rules, this Bitcoin's monetary policy has been set in stone from the beginning. It's never changed. It's had the same exact graph. In fact, I could write out the equation that spells out Bitcoin's monetary policy. You can't do that with US dollars. You can't do that even with gold. I know exactly how much Bitcoin there will ever be. Now, obviously, 21 million, that can never be used as a worldwide currency. We have a lot more than 21 million people. But each Bitcoin, you can't really think of it as one Bitcoin, since it's perfectly divisible into 100 million smaller units. That's how you can enable microtransactions. And I noticed that question in the chat that said, well, obviously Bitcoin, it's capped 21 million. Wouldn't you have deflation? And that's a conversation we'll probably get to later when we start debating this. So I won't touch on that now. But for now, why Bitcoin is special, it's because of those things that came together to create Bitcoin. Every single cryptocurrency, for example, Ethereum. Ethereum is the second largest cryptocurrency by market cap. When I talk about their monetary policy, I have no idea what it really is, because it's going to change in a few months. In their history, their monetary policy has changed. I think it's been 7 or 8 times, since they have a group called the Ethereum Foundation that has that pretty much has a lot of sway and power over the network. Bitcoin has none of that. There's no Bitcoin Foundation. Well, there is. There are people who call themselves the Bitcoin Foundation, but they don't actually do anything. And so Bitcoin, more so than any other cryptocurrency, has a chance at being money. And now we'll talk about whether it can actually be money. Obviously, I don't think it can be considered money by any means in this instant, even though I have used it as a currency. And as I told Professor Salsman, that's how I was initially introduced to Bitcoin in the first place.
Couple things. There's a part, you know this, Jack, there's a part of the current course I'm teaching where we talk about whether things are organized by spontaneous order, still order, or deliberate design. Bitcoin's kind of interesting because it's a little of both, isn't it, Jack? We haven't really talked about this, but it was designed by Satoshi. It has an algorithm. It has, I never heard you use this phrase before. I love it. It has a monetary policy. But we usually think of only central planners having that. But I was in banking for many years. They had a credit policy. They had a lending policy. They had a cash flow balance sheet management policy. What did it mean? Rules by which to govern themselves prudentially. And you're saying, and I think it's true, the more I've investigated it and you've taught me, Bitcoin has a very interesting embedded series of algorithms that give it these features that look, by the way, suspiciously like the gold standard. So we can talk about that, but talk about the 21 million and the fact that 19 million have been created so far. I think the forecast I heard from you is, even though in 12 years, 19 of the 21 million have been mined, you expect it to take 100 years for the next 2 million to be mined. Is that something, is that kind of a mathematical thing about asymptotic, you know, that kind of stuff where it goes slower and slower over time, giving it more stability potentially?
Yeah,
am I missing that?
While Professor Salzman was talking about that, I decided just to sketch out the exact equation. Not sure if it comes up right.
Yeah.
That's the exact equation that specifies Bitcoin's monetary policy.
Yeah.
It's been that same way since the beginning. And
Amazing.
That basically says that every 10 minutes, X amount of Bitcoin is released through the process called mining. And then every 4 years worth of that, or every 200,000 blocks, that number is cut in half. Now, asymptotically, if you were to sketch that out on a graph, it would have that asymptotic shape.
Yes.
And most Bitcoin will be mined by 2030. After that, 2030. Very little new Bitcoin will really enter circulation. The final Bitcoin is going to take, I think it's something like 60 years to mine, that last of the 21 million Bitcoin. So the idea, and speaking with Professor Salzman a little bit about this, one of the main criticisms of Bitcoin is always that it is so volatile. Well, I think that's one of the worst criticisms of Bitcoin because it's inherently designed to be volatile. It has no intrinsic value. All its value is just from what the free market determines its price to be at the time. So when you have a good like that, you're obviously going to have fluctuation based off economic condition, people's sentiment. But then, as I just said about Bitcoin's supply schedule, imagine every 4 years, its inflation rate were suddenly cut in half. That's going to lead to even more volatility. And because of that, every 4 years, Bitcoin is incredibly volatile. And that's when all of us start hearing about Bitcoin. The first time many people heard about Bitcoin was back in 2017. That was right after one of those halving events, and the price of Bitcoin skyrocketed. Since the amount of Bitcoin entering the ecosystem cut in half, that's going to change the supply-demand dynamics. And at that time, many people weren't aware of what was happening with Bitcoin. So it became an easy thing to trade since the price suddenly became incredibly volatile. And that process happens every 4 years. That's why, again, in 2021, after 4 years after 2017, we had the next big spike in Bitcoin's price. Since the halving cycle creates these incredibly volatile just hype cycles, which was in the design of Bitcoin from the very beginning. Satoshi could have designed Bitcoin to just gradually get to that 21 million number. Instead, he decided to have the supply, the new Bitcoin entering, just get cut in half. And half, that's a pretty dramatic shift. So it's designed to be volatile in order to just get people talking about it. Since if Bitcoin weren't volatile, no one would care. No one would be gambling on it. No one would be doing all the things that they are doing with Bitcoin.
The first time you told me that, you remember the first time you told me that? My head was like, I can't believe that was designed, but I get the idea. You launch this thing, it has embedded rules in it, and you don't have any marketing department, any PR firm promoting it. The idea that someone would say, no, this will attract attention if there's volatility. On the other hand, those of us who know the principles of money say, well, the only reason people converged on money in the past is that it had some stability. So what's going on here with Bitcoin? But Jack, I've studied the charts, and I saw the same thing relative to this principle of halving, cutting in half the money. It goes up to 60,000, it comes down to 35. It goes up to 60,000, it comes down to 45. But if you drew a line through the trend is upward. The trend is undeniably upward. Of course, the bubble people would say, yeah, that's true of all bubbles. And then it crashes. But I do see that fluctuation in there. Remember, one time at coffee, I asked you, if that every 4 years cutting in half is in the system, doesn't the market know that, and couldn't you trade around it? And I think remind me of your answer. I think your answer was yes, but that's a good thing.
My answer for that one was that it was certainly a trade that you could make a few years ago, since there was not much information around Bitcoin. Not as many people knew about it, obviously. Right. And most people who had bought Bitcoin didn't even know about this process called halving, which was leading to these cycles. But
it wasn't widely known.
By this point, all that information is going to be priced in. Now, you may see some difference. The next halving will be in 2024. So you may see some difference there, but a fairly popular opinion in the Bitcoin community is that we're kind of done with these every 4 year, this crazy, insane hype cycle. And I saw in the chat that there were a lot of questions about where this 21 million number came from. There's a reason why Satoshi chose 21 million. I'm not fully sure what that reason is. I need to do more reading on that. But that number has been in Bitcoin's source code from the very beginning. So that has never changed. It will be 21 million. And the way that number is just set in stone is that process of mining the new Bitcoin that's released, it keeps getting cut in half. It's gone that way 12 years without any hitches. So I expect it to continue to do so, and until we get to that 21 million.
Interesting. I want to mention two things, Jack, and then get back to you. I want to mention two things to the audience, connecting other things to Bitcoin that might be interesting. One is, which is more recent, Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in '76, Chicago school, known as for free market guy, which he generally was. But interestingly, in money, where he specialized, he was not all that free market. He was against the gold standard. He wanted fiat money. He wanted central banks, but he wanted them to behave themselves. I think he was kind of naive about whether they would. Nevertheless, once they went off the gold standard in '71, which he wanted them to do, he had a rule that said, please increase the money supply 3% a year every year and don't vary from that. That's Bitcoin. That's what Bitcoin does. So whether Satoshi is a gold standard guy or a Milton Friedman gold money supply growth rule guy, that Milton Friedman type stuff is in there. It's basic. I think, Jack, we've talked about that. It's in there. And of course, Friedman would say, by the time he died in 2006, he'd say, I never did get any central bank willing to just increase the money supply 3% a year or whatever he wants. So Friedman's view was the economy grows 3% a year. If we get money to grow 3% a year, there'll be no inflation or deflation. We just can't get these people to follow that rule. Point one. Point two, Bitcoin also has a gold standard principle in it. And I don't know whether Satoshi knew this either, but here's the principle. And one of the reasons the world converged on gold as a standard over thousands of years, not just hundreds of years. Gold, and you could say silver as well. Gold is the only think of this now, is the only commodity ever mined by humans that is mined, accumulated, and not used up. Think of that. It's produced and accumulated. It piles up. People have gold. All the gold that's ever been mined out of the earth still exists above ground. Now, some of it's been lost at sea, but people spend billions, lots of money going to find lost gold. Okay, what does that mean? Like, if oil is produced, we burn the oil. If wheat is produced, we mill it and eat it as bread. Gold just accumulates. Now, what does that mean? It's also a depletable resource. It's hard to find gold. The more gold you find, it's harder to find the next load of gold. And there have been gold rushes and things like that. But think about the math of this now. If the base or stock of gold is going up every year, it is, because it's accumulated, not used up. And the mining, the increment, so to speak, is just a small increment every year. The last time I checked, it was something like 2%, meaning the amount of gold that came out of the ground was only 2% of the above ground gold stock. Now, what does that mean over time? Over time, that number is going to go down. 20 years from now, the increment might be 1.5%. 40 years from now, it might be 1%. 50, 100 years from now, it might be 0.5%. You see the idea? It has the same, interestingly, it has the same asymptotic principle that Bitcoin does. It's remarkable. So I name this only because I name the two schools of thought, if you will, the Friedman monetarists and call it the Austrian gold standard folks, who want sound money, who have identified this principle, and it's actually in Bitcoin, but Bitcoin is an entirely different kind of medium. I recognize. I just want to tie it back to those two because I would say, Jack, to the extent Bitcoin has credibility, and put it this way, metaphysical credibility, anchored in the facts of reality, it's because it shares either and maybe both the Friedman principle and this very interesting gold principle. But back to your story. Well, let me leave it to you, Jack. Where do you want to take this next? Having said what we've said, what do you think the next most important points to make would be?
I think I can look at a few of these questions in the chat.
In the chat? Okay, great. Good.
Maybe since I think maybe a good place to start would kind of just be talking about why Bitcoin has value. Since that's obviously one of the first things people wonder, and I thought it was completely worthless. Again, as Professor Salsman said, the very first time that I ever interacted with Bitcoin, the first few years even of hearing the word Bitcoin, it was the dumbest idea ever. How did
Jack, why did you think that? Why did you think that at the time?
Because why wouldn't I think that? It's this. It's not real. I can never touch it. Why is this? How does
it's not real. It's not tangible. Right. It's not tangible.
Not tangible. That's a big barrier for people. And then I thought, well, who can control it? What if I just decide to create a Bitcoin? Who gets to create Bitcoins? That's another question people have. But then, kind of as I did more reading and research, I then saw that Bitcoin does have a value. And the first time I ever got I told Professor Salsman this story, but the reason why I started on this journey towards understanding Bitcoin and becoming a supporter of Bitcoin was that I actually used it.
This is Jack. This is a great story. Yeah, because I remember telling you, it's not like you looked at some price charts and said, "Hey, I think I'll take a flyer on this crazy investment." Yeah, tell this story because it's almost like a bottom-up story, Jack, right?
Yes, definitely. So the reason why I first used Bitcoin was because I needed to use it. Now, I didn't necessarily need to use it, but the only way for me to deposit money onto this online poker site was through Bitcoin. And this is actually a very similar story to most people who got into Bitcoin. Since, again, the very earliest people who got involved with this were the people who used Bitcoin since they couldn't use any other currency. You couldn't use dollars with your credit card to send to this offshore poker site. I used Bitcoin. Since, again, no one can censor or restrict any transactions. So Bitcoin is a perfect currency for that. So once I bought Bitcoin, it took me forever to figure out how to do it. And then once I sent it to this poker site, I kind of just was amazed. I just sent money somewhere halfway across the world, and it didn't go through any bank. No government enforced it, and no one told me I couldn't do it. That was a pretty special thing. That was pretty cool. And then kind of after doing more research on that, I think it was very good that the way I got into Bitcoin was through using it. Most people involved with Bitcoin or own it, they're only in it because of what's called NGU technology, number go up. They just care about the number in their account balance going up in dollar terms. They're never going to actually buy or sell anything with Bitcoin. They just obviously want to make a profit. They think it could go up. They're speculating with it. They're gambling on it. That's most people. People who get into Bitcoin through that means, I can understand why they're hesitant, they're skeptical about this thing. But if you get into Bitcoin by kind of using it first and then begin to see and I hate saying this word, investment side of it, and I'll speak more on this later because I do not consider Bitcoin to be an investment in any way, but I think it was a very good way that I got into Bitcoin. But
that's interesting, and I would add, when in the history of gold, the same thing happened. I mean, some people looked at it as a monetary thing, but it was an investment speculation for some people too. Now, it doesn't necessarily invalidate it as a monetary thing. Jack, I think since you're talking, it might be easier for me to read the chat, but I'm glad you alerted me to the chat. So let me kind of pick off stuff that you might be able to answer quickly. Sharon asks, how is the value of Bitcoin determined?
Yes, so the value of Bitcoin is determined pretty much as any item in any free market is. What one person is willing to exchange that item with another person. And now how do you get to that? Well, first, let's talk about gold actually here. Where does gold's value come from? Now, obviously, gold has an intrinsic value for its manufacturing use. But is that where all of gold's value comes from? And this is honestly geared towards you, Professor Salsman, as an expert on gold. Where does gold's value come from? It does not all come from the manufacturing purpose. Then there's obviously a monetary premium associated with it. So where does that come from?
And it's also interesting, Jack, that people say, well, we went off the gold standard 50 years ago, so why does gold have any value? Notice the premise. The premise is gold must have had its value because it was connected to the dollar. No, it's the other way around. The dollar had its value because it was connected to gold. Why? Because gold had a basic value that didn't fluctuate much. So no surprise, when they went off the gold standard, when they delinked, it was not gold, but the dollar that fell in value. And that's reflected in a higher dollar gold price. By the way, Milton Friedman predicted that after we went off the gold standard, the gold price would plunge from $35 to $6. It went from $35 to $800. So he was wrong. He too thought that the dollar got that gold got its value from the link, not the other way around. Interesting answer, Jack. I think also this might be a good time, Jack, to talk about supply. I understand you said it's an algorithm that has a fixed growth in the supply, but say a little bit about what the miners do. By the way, another concept I found so fascinating, using the word miners sounds like gold miners. Gold miners going into the mines, bringing out gold. But that word is used in Bitcoin. Kind of explain how that works and maybe include this discussion of the using up of energy, of electricity, and these farms.
Yes, so mining is obviously a term in Bitcoin that is very difficult to understand at first. It's not, you're not using a pickaxe on a computer to get little golden coins that come out of it. That's what I initially thought Bitcoin mining would be, but I was very wrong about that. And so Bitcoin mining is essentially a process by which new transactions are added to the network and the network is secured. So in order to explain that, just a little bit about kind of the Bitcoin network and how the technology works. So basically Bitcoin is this network of computers running a copy of the same ledger, basically a huge book. Now in that book, that all these computers around the world are running, it has a list of every transaction that has ever occurred on the Bitcoin network. So now when you have a list of every single transaction, and you have transactions by sending Bitcoin from one address to another address, and anyone can create an address or do anything like that. So with this list, this ledger of all these transactions, you can see how much Bitcoin people own. Now, obviously, it's not linked to your identity. It's a about 16 alpha numerical hash. But after that,
sorry to interrupt. It's a combination of letters and numbers. And if I was in the system, I'd have my own, Salsman would have his own alphanumeric string, which you can trace through the system. You can't tell it's me, but you can tell it's this same person or whatever doing these, like a Swiss bank account with a number.
Yes, you can see that when an address is doing something.
Yeah.
But if anyone's even remotely savvy with this, you're able to obscure pretty much everything about your identity. Like me personally, when I'm making a Bitcoin transaction, there's pretty much a 0% chance anything would ever be traced back to me or anything like that.
Why?
But so everyone has an address, and most people, and obviously there are apps and websites and software that has been created to make this a much easier process. Since in the early days of Bitcoin, it was very difficult to use. It was very clunky. You had to have programming background to use it. But nowadays there are apps that make this extremely simple.
User friendly. Another phenomenon, Jack, of a more widely accepted service, right? Cars in the beginning, you had to hand crank them, but then they automatic transmission and stuff. Yeah, the whole point is we need to make this user friendly, so we extend the asset, we move it. Yeah,
exactly. And Bitcoin's still very, very young. It's only 12 years old. That's pretty young for something that has had this much of an impact on the economy thus far. But anyways, kind of with our discussion of the technical side, so with your address, now to prove that you are the owner of that address, you have what's called a private key. Each address has a public key and a private key. The public key makes up that address and is what other people can see on the network, things like that. But your private key is how you access your Bitcoin. So your Bitcoin that's stored in your address requires a key. Now that key can be held on your computer, it can be held in your phone, or if you want even more security, it can be held offline so it never touches the internet in kind of a USB thing like this. There are a bunch of different kind of wallet hardware, things like that. And I noticed a question in the chat that I wanted to touch on just real quickly, where someone had said that Bitcoin wallets or the Bitcoin network has been hacked. The network has actually never been hacked, and not a wallet native to the network has never been hacked. What has been hacked are companies that have created custodial wallets. So basically their own wallet that holds your Bitcoin for you. But anyone who holds their Bitcoin directly, none of their wallets, not a single one of their wallets has ever been hacked. But obviously there are tons of examples of third-party services that will custody your Bitcoin for you that have been hacked all the time. So that's amazing. A common misconception. But basically the security, the hashing algorithm that secures Bitcoin, it's the same one used by the NSA, by pretty much every government agency. So if that were ever hacked, with Bitcoin getting hacked, then we'd have a lot more problems in the world than where your Bitcoin is.
Because everyone would be, you're saying everyone would be hacked, but the Pentagon would be hacked.
Yeah, your bank accounts, everything would just be poof, up in flames. But now back to our discussion of mining. So we've got all these transactions. And how then do new transactions get put on this ledger? There are no banks. There's no third party that decides what transaction gets to put on. Instead, there's this perfectly competitive market of computers around the world, individuals, anyone can participate. Any individual can devote their computing power, the processing power, to the network, and in doing so, they become involved in this game. The goal of the game is to guess this long string of numbers every 10 minutes. So every 10 minutes, the transactions that have occurred on the network recently are pooled together. Now, those transactions need a home. Those transactions need to get added to the ledger. In order to do that, one of these computers around the world, the very first one to guess this random number they need to guess, gets to put that transaction on the network. So that's how you ensure this competitive, decentralized system for validating transactions, to where there's no way to censor any individual transaction and to keep up the security of the network. Since in order to hack the Bitcoin network, you need to rewrite basically the book, that ledger of transactions. And think about it. If you've got a copy of this book stored on thousands of computers all around the world, you would need to rewrite it on all of those computers. That seems fairly impossible, or at the very least, implausible. But I don't think that could ever happen. So that's why I'm very confident about Bitcoin ever getting hacked or anything like that. But yeah, that's basically how mining works. And now the process for running those computers is what requires the immense amount of energy. And that's where a lot of the debate around Bitcoin is right now, since it's very true. Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. Now, the amount of energy it uses pales in comparison to the current financial system, since, again, what's behind your bank account on your phone, there's a massive computer farm hosting your data, all of that. It's not just magically there on your phone. Bitcoin's is just a little bit more visible. And people have been there. I have a great collection of articles spanning 5 years back of every single time someone has claimed that Bitcoin mining will use up all of the world's energy by 2020.
Yeah.
Obviously, we're here meeting via computers. We haven't used up all of our energy yet. And so it's good for now. But one thing that I do say, and yes, I see that question in the chat. Exactly. The current financial system hosts way more transactions than Bitcoin. And even when you break it down to the individual rate, the current financial system uses way more. But remember, the process for mining, it's not something that's going to happen forever.
The opposite.
Oh, sorry.
Say again.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
On an apples-to-apples basis, Bitcoin mining and use is incredibly inefficient, and it is. It's in many ways. Inefficient. That's there are people who see the need for it. The market purchases all the electricity it uses. The free market purchases that energy. So whether that's an efficient use of resources, that there can be a debate on that.
No, like on the cost basis that you were discussing earlier. Like on a per transaction basis, Bitcoin uses so much more energy than a single financial transaction.
Can I just intervene here? That's a really good point. Let me just intervene here contextually. When the gold standard existed, critics said it's costly. What the heck? Why do we do it? We mine gold, we store it, we move it. This is a cumbersome, inefficient, clunky system. But it was one of the greatest monetary systems ever created. Milton Friedman said that same thing. He said, this is ridiculous. Why? And Keynes, why are we spending all this money mining gold, putting it in vaults, and not converting it into anything? By then, it was not convertible. Milton Friedman said, get rid of this gold standard, and the cost of issuing and managing money will plummet. This will be a great boon to the economy. Guess what happened that he never predicted? When you go to floating exchange rates, you need foreign exchange traders and forecasters. Starting in 1971. Prior to that, nobody traded currencies because they were the same price every day. But also it led to big fluctuations in interest rates, big fluctuations in a whole bunch of other things. So the whole market, think of thousands of people devoting their brain power to predicting futures and options and currencies and this and that, only because we went off the gold standard. And just before he died, Friedman said, I never imagined that would be a cost. And he said, I think it's more costly than the gold standard. So Jack, I just wanted to pitch in here and say, it's not that Bitcoin is costless. It might even be a little more costly than some other system. Although fiat money, you just print it, right? What's the cost? You just print the stuff. And now digital. Yeah. So it's not necessarily an argument against an asset because it's difficult to create. I mean, if it was easy to create, we'd hyperinflate Bitcoin, wouldn't we, Jack?
Exactly. So one of the reasons why Bitcoin needs to use that much energy is that that's the way it's secured. And also, when Satoshi was devising the way that people would acquire new Bitcoin, he had to figure out a way to distribute this currency to the world. The way he came up with doing that was people have to exchange a valuable commodity, in this case energy, for this new commodity. So you couldn't just get
amazing.
It
That's an amazing
you
insight.
actually had to put in work. That's why it's called proof of work. So that's basically the system. And also, when it comes to the individual figures about energy cost, a lot of times it shows the energy cost per Bitcoin is on a transaction basis, but Bitcoin transactions is not what uses up energy. Bitcoin mining is what uses up energy. The whole world could start using Bitcoin and it would use the same exact amount of energy as it does right now. However, if more people start mining Bitcoin, then it will use more energy. And the idea is that down the road, even if Bitcoin were to become this future global currency, which obviously very slim chance of that, but if it does, it would not use drastically much more energy than it even does at this point, since it is only based in proportion to the amount of people who are mining Bitcoin, since that's where the energy then is expended, not on the transaction basis. And that's where you get these crazy numbers for Bitcoin's potential energy use when you start extrapolating based off data that you can't really extrapolate.
It strikes me also, Jack, that if we're only 2 million away from the cap, it doesn't seem like a lot of mining is left to go. And the whole halving process every 4 years is, we haven't said this yet, but how are the miners paid? How are they remunerated? They're paid in Bitcoin, right? And but if the remuneration due them is cut in half, which is I think of what you told me, wouldn't the use of energy? I don't like the whole use of energy argument. Who cares? If it's a good product, use more energy, including fossil fuels. I don't care. But is that true, Jack, that you could come back and say it's going to use a lot less energy over the next 12 years versus the last 12 years? Or is that wrong?
Well, it all depends on the amount of people mining Bitcoin. Okay. And obviously, as the price of Bitcoin goes up, more people will want to mine it. So there could be more people mining it. But again, the profit margins in Bitcoin, since there's less Bitcoin being released every 4 years, there might be fewer people who want to mine it then. So a lot of people theorize that we might have hit a peak of the amount of computers mining Bitcoin, and thus a peak in the amount of emissions by Bitcoin. But another thing about Bitcoin and why it can be a force for kind of this force for good when it comes to energy is that when it comes to renewable energy sources, a lot of issues that we currently have with renewable sources is how to store them. With solar, the batteries, it's incredibly inefficient. But imagine if you had this thing where with any excess energy you had, you could instantly convert it into money. You just have a Bitcoin mining farm right there on your solar field.
I hadn't heard
Rather than figuring out a way to store that excess energy that is extremely expensive, you instantly convert it into money. In doing so, you create a far more efficient energy market. And that's why I like to call Bitcoin the energy buyer of last resort. It can kind of get all this stranded energy. And people have started doing that on oil fields out in Colorado and Wyoming. With the flare gas from fracking, they just have these little huts of Bitcoin miners that are immediately converting that otherwise wasted energy into Bitcoin. But yes, Bitcoin uses a lot of energy. And there's a reason why it uses that energy.
I think the other thing I've heard from you, which is brilliant, is in cases where it's shut down or restricted, like in China, you're saying it's like squeezing the balloon. They just go somewhere else. Or they go somewhere else, and they might be restricting the mining of Bitcoin, but not the use of it. It goes to the lowest energy cost in the world, which is exactly what a profiteer would do, Jack, right? They're looking for, how can I mine this with the least energy cost? I wanted to, Jack, if you don't mind, Lawrence asked a great question. It was a little earlier, but Lawrence, who's at Atlas Society and I've worked with before, and I love him dearly. So Lawrence says, cryptocurrencies don't seem to be a proper currency. Yet in my opinion, the way people interact with it is more like one treats a stock. So this is back to this issue, Jack, of is it a money or is it an investment? So here, Jack, I would just interject, comment a little bit on the usual standard traditional properties of money: store of value, medium of exchange, unit of account. We all got this in college. These are the three things that money must be. There's debates about what must come first. I think your view is store of value must come first. Stability of store of value. Medium of exchange is just what do we use in transactions. Unit of account is what shows up in the accounting in the public accounting statements. Talk about that, Jack, how it relates to fiat and gold. I know that's a huge topic, but is it money or just this speculative investment? And are we in, the internet bubble 1999, or are we at the beginning of a amazing new currency that looks a lot like gold?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, first of all, I think that when we think about Bitcoin as money, you have to think about it on a lot longer of a time horizon.
Okay.
When it comes to gold, we didn't just suddenly start using gold as money. That was a process that took thousands of years, honestly, to develop into the system that the gold standard became. And now that's something that arose about naturally, spontaneous order, as we've discussed in your class, Professor Salsman. And I think Bitcoin is something similar to that. It's not money. It might never be money, but with the properties, as it's Bitcoin has gone from a value of 0 to now close to $1 trillion market cap.
Yeah.
That's a pretty fascinating phenomenon.
Yeah.
And as with gold, Bitcoin has a specific narrative attached to it. People wouldn't buy gold and use it as money if they didn't believe the narrative associated with it. We kind of all fell into this shared belief that gold, this shiny, durable metal rock, had the best qualities to be money. And I believe the same is true of Bitcoin. And so I think that Bitcoin and gold will have that similar evolution. Obviously, there are things that need to be worked out with Bitcoin, just as just using a shiny rock in the ground suddenly didn't become this currency.
Right.
So it has to be looked at in a way longer time horizon. And I just think that the work that has been done in 12 years is already remarkable and does give me some hope at where this could potentially lead. But again, it's very difficult to use. Most people don't even use it as a currency. They've never even transacted with it. And it is just a speculative asset. But in becoming a speculative asset like that, it's deriving a market value. You can see how much a Bitcoin is worth. It's one of the most free competitive markets that exists in the world. There are all these exchanges, and it's very similar to gold. So there is a value to Bitcoin. It's whatever people are willing to buy or sell it for.
A couple of other questions. By the way, one of the things, you have to read his essay called Bitcoin, Our Only Hope to Separate Money in the State. One of the things Jack says in there is very intriguing language. Bitcoin is gold 2.0. So he really has this knowledge of alternative monetary systems. And I think one of the most interesting formulations you had, Jack, was something like, gold is kind of clunky, hard to move in vast volumes across borders, but it has a stable value. Roy Drastrom many years ago wrote a book called The Golden Constant. And he said, if you look closely, the purchasing power of gold has been amazingly constant for centuries, kind of like a yardstick, 3 feet every day. And he said, that's why they converged on gold as money, because it has that property. And but you said Bitcoin's almost right now the opposite. Easy to move around, cross borders and all that kind of thing. But people are still questioning it, the stability of its value. What do you mean by it? Also, you say at one point, it's the permissionless currency. I love that phrase. What do you mean permissionless? And all your other essays on, I kind of love, Bitcoin is for the sovereign individual. Bitcoin is the patriotic thing to do. Bitcoin is uniquely American. I love that stuff, Jack. But elaborate. What do you mean by that? What is the connection between liberty, sovereignty, and Bitcoin?
Yeah, so again, when I say permissionless, that relates to the Bitcoin network. The Bitcoin network is completely permissionless. Anyone with internet access or even radio access can access the Bitcoin network. So obviously, when it comes to that, by this point, pretty much everyone in the world can access the Bitcoin network, even people in countries where Bitcoin has been banned, since it's a lot more difficult to ban the internet than it is to ban Bitcoin. And so anyone in the world can then get onto this network. And from there, as we've discussed with this process of mining, which ensures this means of transacting with people all around the world without going through any centralized parties, that's how I believe it can be this great force for liberty. Since if you can send a transaction and have no risk or no fear of that being censored, that's a pretty powerful thing. But another thing comes from being able to custody your value. And that's where I think Bitcoin is really special. Since Bitcoin, it is really easy to store large amounts of value, and you are the full, you have full custody over it. If you try to store $1 million worth of gold, that's going to be very difficult. That's also going to be very difficult to move. You're going to have to find somewhere to bury it, find somewhere to hide it, or you're going to have to give it to a bank, have them stored in a vault. But with Bitcoin, this little thing right here, this alone can store billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin. Sadly, I don't have billions of dollars worth of Bitcoin on there.
Someday, Jack.
Hopefully. Even if you didn't want to store it on here, as long as you remember the recovery code to your wallet address, keep it up there, you're good. So imagine that you have this asset, this form of property that cannot be seized, since with gold, easily you can come raid someone's home, take it from them. You can have your bank account frozen. You can't have that done with Bitcoin. So it severely limits government overreach in the sense that if people are able to custody their value, then there's a road that goes down. But
Jason asks, I assume you know what a reserve currency means, Jack. Is Bitcoin going to be the reserve currency among cryptos? I think that basically means the alpha dog that wins out versus all the others. All the others become convertible into Bitcoin. I assume that's what you think about Bitcoin, because you think it's the premier of all the cryptos, yes?
I think it's the premier when it comes to potentially storing value and potentially serving as money. But a lot of cryptocurrencies, they have very different goals. They have very different aims. And Bitcoin is just one of them. Bitcoin's the one with the least amount of problems or issues I've seen associated with them. But who knows what will end up winning. When it comes to becoming money, though, I believe Bitcoin is the only one that has a fighting shot. And also, just from a psychological perspective, imagine Ethereum overtakes Bitcoin. Well, now something's overtaken the top dog. What's going to overtake Ethereum? And then what's going to overtake the one that does that? But in its entire existence, Bitcoin has always been the market leader. And you've seen that in the way the market operates. When Bitcoin goes up in these the rest of the cryptocurrency market follows Bitcoin's halving cycles. In 2017, the rest of the cryptocurrency market boomed. And in 2021, after Bitcoin's halving in 2020, the rest of the market followed. So Bitcoin is the one that's the leader. And now with that question, when it comes to the reserve crypto asset, a lot of people believe that there will be a different cryptocurrency created that is kind of for everyday use. That's a lot easier to serve as a medium of exchange and a unit of account. but then Bitcoin will kind of just be gold in that sense.
It'll be like
in my opinion, I don't think that's a very likely outcome.
Yeah.
Since you're going to have to create that cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And for some of the reasons that I've discussed in this class,
yeah.
I don't think you could ever create a cryptocurrency again that can serve as good money.
Wow. Interesting. So Ethereum, by the way, Jack, I mean, the way you described Ethereum earlier, it has a committee and they've changed it 7 times already. If that's what people wanted, they wouldn't be buying Bitcoin. They would be buying Federal Reserve notes with a committee ruining the thing every 8 weeks. Timothy asks, related question, will the value of Bitcoin plateau once all the Bitcoins have been mined? Well, that's the asymptotic point, isn't it, Jack? Would you predict that in the next 10 years? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so when it comes to that, there is some worry that once all the Bitcoins have been mined, what's the incentive to mine Bitcoin? Since again, mining is what ensures the network security. It's how new transactions are added. But the revenue for miners, it comes from that block subsidy, that amount of Bitcoin that is released from the original 21 million. But then another part comes from transaction fees. So the idea is that once that block subsidy is all spent up, and that's very far down the road, but when that day comes, the idea is that Bitcoin has reached a tipping point to where the revenue generated from transaction fees is enough to support and incentivize miners to still continue to contribute their computing power.
Right,
but in that world where all the Bitcoin is mined, theoretically, if new Bitcoin is not entering the ecosystem by pure supply and demand, if the demand still remains for Bitcoin and the supply is non-existent, price would go up.
Well, it's not that the supply is non-existent. It's not going up anymore.
Exactly.
Okay, so I would make the case, Jack. Suppose you knew next year it was at 21 million, and all the hand wringers would say, "Oh my God," and suppose the dollar wasn't being used anymore. Another big assumption. They'll say that, "Oh, a terrible deflation is coming." What are they used to seeing? They're used to seeing the 1930s collapse of the money supply by 30%. The collapse of the money supply, no longer an increase in the money supply, but a collapse by 30%. Of course, you're going to get a deflation. That was the paper dollar going off the gold standard under FDR. So nobody trusted the delinked dollar anymore. So I think you can make a case, as Milton Friedman did, if the money supply is fixed, Jack, and the economy grows 3% a year, I mean, just the math of it is, so prices go down 2 or 3% a year. So what? We often think of the CPI as the cost of living. The cost of living just went up 7% last year, and people are complaining, right? Inflation, 7%. What if it was 2%? People would say, that's a lot better than 7. I can afford the basket of goods I just bought. Well, what if I told you it's 3% less? The cost of living is going down. Most people would love that. And so it's not a massive deflation of the kind that occurred in the 30s. But what's wrong with George Selgin has argued this, as you know, Jack, at GM, Larry White, the free banking people, the gold standard people. So what if there's a mild decline in prices over time? That means you can afford more stuff. You don't want to collapse. You don't want a 30% collapse. But that is not what Bitcoin is proposing, so to speak. It's saying we're increasing the money supply, and yes, sometime over the next 50 or 60 years, it might be fixed, but so what? It's not a bad thing.
I want to just jump in. I don't mean to interrupt, but I want to open up. We've got about 15 minutes left. I think Jake has some questions, things he'd like to say. I'd like to open it up for some people.
Maybe take some verbal questions. Yeah, go ahead, Abby. Yeah, good.
Oh, yeah. Dr. Salsman brought up a point that I think is really important. I also just want to say, I think it's so impressive how much Jack knows about Bitcoin. But I started off, I guess, in a similar place maybe as Jack, like a little bit skeptical. But unlike Jack, I think I've grown much more polarized against Bitcoin, specifically Bitcoin, but also cryptocurrency, but mainly Bitcoin, for a very fundamental reason that Dr. Salsman just brought up. On a very fundamental level, from a monetary economic point of view, deflation is very bad. It's much like 7% deflation or inflation. Like nobody likes 7% inflation, but deflation is generally so much worse than inflation for the following reason. If you have, on a very fundamental level, if you have the expectation of deflation, that means that everything you buy today is going to be less expensive tomorrow. That's what deflation is, and that fundamentally incentivizes hoarding. That's a really big problem for business cycles. Deflation is one of the biggest reasons why the Great Depression in the 1930s lasted as long as it did, and rather inflation at a very low rate, around 2%, is. I don't mean to pose in such hard disagreement, but I think my disagreement is so fundamental. Like, if you have inflation, I would pose that it's good to have a low, positive, stable inflation rate to the extent that population is growing. If your population grows while you do not have a positive inflation rate, money is becoming more. If your money is effectively becoming more and more scarce by definition, which is that's a fundamental reason why it's good to have a positive, stable, low inflation rate. I'd say that. Yeah,
Jake, let me just interject, Jake. I disagree with that entirely. To advocate 2% inflation, you're basically advocating an increase in the cost of living every year for people. Why? That is improper.
No, well, you also have nominal wage growth as well. Like when you think about real, yes, inflation increases by 2%, but if your wages increase by 2%, you've had no change in real terms.
That's what we're facing now under the fiat money system. I don't know why that's something you would endorse. Here's the point I want to make. Neither the gold standard nor, I would say, but object if you want, Jack, neither the gold standard nor Bitcoin create inflation or deflation. They just don't. Why? Because of the same principle I named earlier. They have this stock. The stock doesn't dissipate, and it's incrementally increased every year. Brilliant. The most amazing monetary system you can imagine. If Bitcoin can match what gold did, the gold standard did, amazing. The system you're talking about, Jake, is the fiat money system. That's the one that creates two things: massive deflation and massive hyperinflation. That's so when you say a 30% decline in prices is disruptive, of course it is, but it has nothing to do with the gold standard. It has everything to do with the fiat standard. And
I don't have anything. I don't have any claims against the gold. I mean, I think there are separate problems wrong with the gold standard. There are. I don't feel very strongly about the gold standard.
No, but Jake, the problems you're naming in deflation are in the fiat system. They're not related to gold or Bitcoin.
Weren't we on the gold standard no. We were in a transitionary period?
No,
in
the deflation. Yeah, you're right. No, the deflation of the 1930s was due to going off the gold standard. Britain went off in 31, and everyone raced to get their money out of the banks. Guess why? Because the gold standard was going to be suspended. They wanted their money in gold. So it was the it was the threat of going to fiat money that made people run the banks. So anyway, that's more of a historical thing we can argue about.
I think there are two issues with that. One, yeah. I agree with your assessment, but this was long before we had the invention of independent central banking. What independent central banking does, I mean, a lot of macroeconomists retroactively say that if we would have increased the money supply on the eve of or during Depression, that would have alleviated deflationary tendencies. I'd also just want to point out that Bitcoin, by definition, is deflationary because there's a hard cap at 21 million.
It might be a mild deflation, but the difference between prices going down 2 or 3% a year and going down 30% is a huge difference, Jake. And the latter occurred under central banks mismanaging the gold standard and FDR and others threatening to go off of it. But let's move on. Abby, do you have other?
A pizza in 2010 would cost like tens of thousands of dollars worth of Bitcoin today. That's very fundamentally deflation.
But also the deflation from Bitcoin, that's not imposed on anybody. You use Bitcoin at your own free will.
Well, yeah,
So
you're not forced to use dollars either.
no, you're
Yes,
not.
you
But
are.
the dollars,
That's
then,
what legal
in
tender
some
laws are.
senses, if you
They
live
do
here, you're forced to pay your taxes. If you pay taxes, or if you live here, you have to pay taxes. You have to pay taxes in dollars. So in that sense, I guess you would be forced. But with inflation under the fiat system, that's then a decision that is being made. With Bitcoin, that any deflation, if it exists, it's already been set into that system from the very beginning, and it's only being and anyone who uses the network has already opted into that network from the very beginning.
Sure, but that doesn't make it a good. That doesn't make it a good currency.
No, which is why I'm not saying that we should force everyone to use Bitcoin. People should use Bitcoin.
Yeah, people can do whatever they want.
I don't exactly.
I'm just saying, is it a good currency? And my answer is absolutely not.
And let's remind ourselves, and Jack, you might want to mention the El Salvador case. It's not true, Jake, that you can use whatever you want. We haven't mentioned the legal aspect of this. You have to use the fiat dollar. You have to. That's what legal tender laws mean. They mandate that you use the dollar. You cannot use any other currency. Why do they do that? That's why it's called fiat. Fiat means force. You must use our money even though it sucks. Bitcoin doesn't have that. Bitcoin doesn't demand that. Although, Jack, to your credit, I seen you write on El Salvador, which for some weird reason just passed legal tender laws saying you must use Bitcoin. It's ridiculous. No one should be forced to use any money. And if that were true, no one would use this stupid government money. The only reason people use this stupid government money all over the world is they're mandated to legally. It's called legal tender laws. People should look that up. You want to comment on El Salvador? Why did they do that?
Yeah, definitely. And so what's important to understand about Bitcoin is that Bitcoin is neutral money. People are going to use it however they wish to use it. Politicians are going to enact mandates. A politician in El Salvador, a young politician who, from what I could tell beforehand, did not really understand a lot about Bitcoin, saw that there was this huge community around the world who supported it and saw a very easy way for him to kind of build a base for himself. And he's amassed a massive name. He was just recently in Turkey talking to Erdogan about Bitcoin. But a lot of Bitcoin supporters are very opposed to what's happening in El Salvador. But again, Bitcoin is neutral money. So there are going to be bad politicians who force people to use it. Now, the way it's actually worked in El Salvador is that those legal tender laws, it forced merchants to accept Bitcoin in practice. It has not been strictly enforced, but it is still terrible language to have in a bill. But Bitcoin is still a system that you opt into. Politicians are going to force people to do things. They love doing that. So this is simply a case of what happened in El Salvador. And that has nothing to do with Bitcoin, since Bitcoin's neutral money. Bad people are going to use it. Good people are going to use it. And it's important, though, that everyone is able to use it and that no one can determine those people that get to use Bitcoin.
Jack, one of the things you said in your essays was the 3-part ban by China and maybe I think you mentioned some other countries. You said this is a lesson in look at the countries that try to ban it. That should tell us something. Who are they and what does it tell us?
Yeah, exactly. Most famous example, China. China has been very against Bitcoin, and it's going to hurt them geopolitically. And let's think about China.
Wow.
Do they strike you as someone pro-liberty, pro the ideals that Bitcoin stands for? No. If authoritarian countries were not banning Bitcoin, then I'd start getting worried. But since then it would be seen as a threat. If you start seeing politicians speaking more about banning Bitcoin, that's when you can start thinking that, okay, maybe Bitcoin is actually doing something. Since once it's a threat, then they're going to ban it. That's why it was banned in China. Although banning the network, again, you can't ban the network. What you can do is you can ban the centralized companies that allow people to buy and sell Bitcoin. You can ban the companies that are mining Bitcoin. Obviously, there are ways around that and stuff, but that's what you can ban. That's what you can regulate. You cannot regulate what's directly happening on the network, since, again, that would require rewriting that ledger on all those thousands of computers around the world.
So, Jack, if you're in the put yourself in the CPC, concretize for me, what is the threat? In the councils of the CBC, they're saying, oh my God, we got to get rid of it. What is the threat? What would they say the threat is?
The threat that Bitcoin poses?
Yes.
Primarily
to
the fact
the Chinese central planners. Yeah. What would they say among themselves? It's a threat.
again,
How?
that people are able to send transactions without going through ostensibly the CCP, since China uses
and the
money
social credit system. And
exactly, they use money as a surveillance tool. You obviously can't do that with Bitcoin.
Wow.
Another thing which we were talking about is how easy it is to store huge sums of money with Bitcoin.
Yeah.
If I had all this money
Yeah.
on here, think about
Yeah.
how easy it would be to evade
Yeah.
taxes if I just had it
Yeah.
purely in my mind, where
Yeah.
they can't then freeze that bank account.
Right.
Which is why in a lot of countries, Alexei Navalny, he's a huge user of Bitcoin. When Putin decided to freeze all of his bank accounts in Russia, he started raising money using Bitcoin, since obviously Putin can't do anything to change that.
Wow.
And so that's why obviously a country like China would be very scared of Bitcoin, since money can be used as a means of surveillance. It can be used as a tool for censorship. And I noticed in the notes for the webinar, we're going to maybe have a discussion on central bank digital currencies.
Yeah, say something about that, because to me, Jack, that includes it's not the central monetary authority saying we're going to kill Bitcoin, but rather we're going to co-opt. We're going to issue our digital and just take over. Is that a fair reading of what they're trying? How do you? Because in one of your essays, you said that is one of the most authoritarian things you could imagine that we end up with. They just co-opt the system. They just become the monopoly issuer of digital currency. They just overtake Bitcoin like they monopolize fiat money. All right, elaborate.
Exactly. So Bitcoin and central bank digital currencies, they could not be more different. Bitcoin, its value is purely determined by the free market. Central bank digital currency, exactly like the dollar, its value is just simply what the government says it is. And it's also issued by a government. It's issued by a party that decides that can manipulate its supply at will. But what is very scary and what's very dangerous about a central bank digital currency is the nefarious things a government could do now that they have money purely digital. Since think about cash. The reason a lot of people like to use cash because there's no paper trail.
Right.
Now, if you had a digital currency, you have a trail of everything that happens, and that trail is perfectly in the government logs. Now, what's also concerning is that if you have a currency that you completely control, you can also restrict where that money is sent.
Yeah.
Groups that are suddenly labeled as extremist, or who knows what they could be labeled as, then you would not be able to send money back and forth. They could easily restrict, they could easily confiscate it, since you would hold. The model for most central bank digital currencies is that you essentially hold an account with the central bank. So having a true central bank currency, digital currency, would really represent a drastic shift in the way the banking system operates. So the most likely outcome when it comes to CBDCs is this thing called a synthetic CBDC, which Professor Salsman, George Selgin was actually talking a lot about today, and he recently wrote a new essay on. But in many cases, it's this digital currency, but then it still goes through the traditional banking system.
Yeah.
But
may I come in now? So we discussed most part of our discussion was around currency. What do you think if we can fashion this as an asset class? And today, most of the assets are as liquid as any currency could be, right? The advantage of treating it as an asset is that the fear of the government to tax the gains from this exchange, transfer of assets, will be possible. And secondly, if you look at it, you're basically trying to create a parallel economy where there is no border. Money can flow from, some one person in US to another person in whichever part of geography. And no government will be comfortable with that, I guess. So, Professor Salsman, do you have any views on that?
Well, on the first one, capital gain, there's a bias against using gold because they treat it as an asset subject to capital gains taxes. So the legal tender laws and the tax laws bias against gold. So when people say, well, you can buy and sell gold now, so why aren't we back on the gold standard? Because there are legal and tax impediments to going to gold. But Jack, I don't know the tax treatment of Bitcoin, but is it similar?
See, people are very upset with the tax treatment of Bitcoin since when you're sending it, it's treated as money, as like when you would send dollars. But when you buy and sell it, or when you even just hold it, it's treated as property. So it has kind of two distinct different classifications for how the government wants to operate it. So when they want their cut, they treat it as property that allows them to collect capital gains. But then when it comes to reporting requirements for people sending money to each other, it's viewed as money. So that's a huge thing that a lot of people in Bitcoin and crypto want to change. But again, it's very difficult to change laws when it comes from this industry's perspective, since it's a very decentralized industry by its very nature. So it's tough to get that lobbying push to change any laws. And so, but yeah, that's a huge topic right now and was actually what held up a lot of the infrastructure bill this last summer. The reason why it took so many days to pass that initially was because of this small little provision in the bill where they would raise X amount of money through new ways of taxing Bitcoin, written by people who clearly had no idea how any of this stuff works. But
or Jack, they knew and they wanted to either get in on the advance or squash it. I could see Jay Powell calling Congress saying, squash it, squash it. By the way, I know we're running out of time here, so I just want to throw in modern monetary theory says the government can issue money without limit and not cause inflation. Point one. Point two, they can issue debt without limit and not have bond prices plummet, which is another way of saying not have interest rates go up that much. Jack, I'm tying this back to the central bank digital currency thing because I think part of the motive for the central bank saying enough of this money creation and stuff like that, let's just be able to access everybody's account and with a touch of a button, put money in their account or take money out of their account. How wonderful would that be? We don't have to wait for, tax legislation to pass. We don't have to wait for QE to blah, 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 blah. It's a complete takeover of the financial system by the central bank, which it's already doing. I mean, all the major banks are basically in the pocket of the central bank. They're basically subsidiaries of the Treasury. They're not independent entities anymore. I think you're saying Bitcoin allows us to escape that. We don't have any more years to escape it. So that's one of the reasons you like it, right? You think there's monetary authoritarianism happening, and you don't like it.
Yeah, and another one, a lot of times people ask me, so how does Bitcoin win, or what does Bitcoin do to win? And in my opinion, Bitcoin wins simply by existing. As long as people have this opportunity to transact in this money that is completely outside of any control of any individual, government, or corporation, then Bitcoin has served its purpose. As long as I can still hold large amounts of value and custody it myself and then send money anywhere in the world, Bitcoin is winning. And so in a future where, as I'm sure we all can tell with what's happened the last few years, we are on that trend towards more authoritarianism. So in a future like that, I think something like Bitcoin that allows you to transact value with the world and interact with the world, it's a perfect time for something like this.
One last thing. I don't know if Professor Kelly is still with us. David, are you still there? Yes, no.
Still here, Richard.
David, Jack, first of all, Jack, I want to introduce you to David Kelly, just a brilliant philosopher of objectivism, probably the world's premier epistemologist. So you're talking to a philosopher here, but he founded the Atlas Society 30 years ago. And David knows a lot about economics and more about money than he'll admit. But David, not to put you on the spot, David, what do you think of all this discussion? Does it seem too remote? Does it seem reasonable? Does it seem tied to reality? I'm kind of anxious to hear your view, so we're not on some intergalactic pursuit here. What do you think, David?
Well, I don't think you've been intergalactic. I think you've been down in the not in the weeds, so to speak, but you're in the details of something I know little about. Okay. My sense of and I'm a totally layperson, both theoretically and in as an individual who's got retirement funds, not in fiat money, admittedly, not Bitcoin. I've always thought that the two things that I understand about Bitcoin or cryptocurrency in general is that it's not fiat money, it's not government run. That's good. But I've wondered about what its basis in reality is. Gold is a basis. Currency, even today, to some extent, fiat currency is tied to the productive wealth of an economy. And I've wondered what Bitcoin's, what the foundation of it is in terms of a real value in reality. Now, Jack made a great point, and I have to settle this. I have to think about it more. That the energy cost of producing Bitcoin is, in a sense, like the mining cost of gold. And that's really intriguing. I never thought of that. And as we know from Einstein, matter and energy are kind of interchangeable. So I've really opened my eyes. Thank you, Jack. And but that's about what I can say at this point. I've got a lot to learn, a lot to think about.
Yeah, and I think, David, it's always intrigued me that the connection between call it the Bitcoin community and libertarian thought. It's interesting. Like Jack, if you were to say, do you come across many people who are socialists who say, "Hey, Bitcoin's great. I love Bitcoin," or is that a rare overlap? And if so, why?
You don't have a ton of socialists in Bitcoin. You have a fair amount of progressives, though, and there's a common misconception that everyone in Bitcoin is right-wing. A lot of the initial people, because of the way that they found it, they were more libertarian-leaning, and most people heavily involved with Bitcoin do lean libertarian. But there was a book written a few years ago by a huge critic of Bitcoin. He titled it Bitcoin Software as Right-Wing Extremism. That was the title of the book. And I don't get how a money that does nothing other than simply existing is this form of extremism. But pretty much, as I said before, Bitcoin's for everybody. And there's a group of people, even progressives, who they've started this little, not caucus, but there are a swelling number of them since they have reasons to support Bitcoin. They see it as this pro-democracy tool. They also do not like the way that authoritarian regimes can use money as a authoritarian tool. And so they see Bitcoin as an escape from that. But yes, most people involved with Bitcoin did come from that kind of the same not libertarian or conservative vein of thinking, but it's still a very diverse community when it comes to thought.
Yeah. And Jack, when I think today about if someone stood up like this old professor from Duke, Salsman, stood up and said, I'm for the gold standard. What would they say? You right-wing wacko, get out of here. And yet, if you look at the history, how did the gold standard evolve? It wasn't a partisan thing. People just looked at it and said, hey, that's a good product. I trust that product. I'm going to use gold. Nobody did a poll of it. Now, eventually, as a standard and as a political economic phenomenon, you see it as, wow, that's something that kind of limits and handcuffs the fiscal profligacy of the state. Hey, that's a right-winger advocating gold. But I like the way you're approaching this, Jack. You're saying, listen, look at the underlying bottom-up constituents of this amazing thing. Who wouldn't want to use it? Why do you care what political party you're in? But
exactly. And going off of that, a common phrase within the Bitcoin community is that Bitcoin is money for enemies. We don't have to agree with each other to use Bitcoin. That's the beauty of it being a neutral money. We can all use it and we all experience the same properties from it. No one receives special treatment on the network. And that's why I think money should kind of have those neutral properties. It's too powerful of an institution to put in the control of anybody. So that's why I support Bitcoin pretty much.
Yeah, the last thing I would say, which I think is very interesting, is the gold standard people like myself, the only shot we have had in the last 50 years of getting it reinstituted is when there's been high inflation and high craziness and stuff like that. There was a gold commission in 1982. Why? Because inflation was 15%, to return to it. One of the things that strikes me as interesting about Bitcoin, Jack, is, I mean, you talk about Bitcoinization that might occur when there's a hyperinflation of the fiat money, namely people would really race into Bitcoin, but people are already moving into Bitcoin. And when you trace it from 2008, as you did, to now, I mean, 2008 until now has not been a high inflation period. It's only been the last year, that we've gone above 2 or 3%. So to me, that's another argument for Bitcoin. It's unlike the gold bugs. It doesn't really rely on episodes of scary high inflation. It's kind of chugging along, creating its base. You know what I mean, Jack? I mean, it might accelerate under inflation, but it's got something else going for it other than fears of fiat money inflation. Would you agree with that, or no?
Yeah, there are a lot of reasons to just buy or be into Bitcoin. And obviously a lot of what money is just kind of the story that we attach to it. And so there's the inflation hedge narrative with Bitcoin having a scarce supply. But then there are also people who demand Bitcoin to use it as a currency, or to use it to send value, or because they wish to be able to custody large sums of value. And there's no other asset that can do that quite the way that Bitcoin is capable of doing. But
Richard and Jack, if I could add one historical point to Jack's thing, that this is a market. It's not that people put aside their ideology to participate in. Voltaire in the 1700s visited England, and he made a great point. He visited the stock exchange in England, in London, and said, here, I forget his exact categorization, Protestants, Jews, Mohammedans, they all combined because there's only one religion, money. And that's a great early observation of the unifying effect of the principle of trade.
And David, the other thing he said, I love that quote too. The quote ends with, and the only infidel is the bankrupt.
Even better.
Remember that?
I do.
The only infidel is the one who doesn't pay his debts. I love that, because he's using, of course, the Muslim Islamic view of infidel.
Right.
Jack, I could not thank you more. I'm so proud of you, and I know you're going to learn more about this stuff over the years, but I can't imagine this audience and the ones who will see this later won't absolutely adore the stuff you're doing. It's really special. It's really smart, really creative, and you've done a lot of work tonight. And I really thank you so much, Jack. It's just been, from my perspective, it's just been fabulous.